You're always the embarrassment, my family said every holiday. So when I bought my dream condo, I threw a huge party and sent invites to everyone but them. They found out on Instagram. The comments were glorious. I, 32M, have always been the black sheep of my family. Every holiday gathering, every family dinner, every celebration, I was the one they'd roll their eyes at, the one whose achievements were dismissed, the one who somehow always managed to embarrass them just by existing. Growing up, my older brother was the golden child. Perfect grades, perfect job at dad's accounting firm, perfect wife, perfect kids. My sister wasn't far behind. Married young to a lawyer, stayed home with the kids, lived in the suburbs exactly like mom always dreamed. Then there was me, the one who dropped out of college to start my own business, the one who lived in a cramped apartment, the one who showed up to family events in jeans while everyone else wore their Sunday best. The comments started early and never stopped. Mom would introduce my siblings with pride, rattling off their accomplishments, then get to me with a forced smile and say I was still figuring things out. Dad would ask when I was going to get a real job. My brother would make jokes about my lifestyle choices. My sister would give me pitying looks and ask if I needed money. Last Thanksgiving was the breaking point. I had just landed my biggest client yet, a tech startup that wanted me to handle their entire digital marketing strategy. The contract was worth more than my brother made in 6 months, but when I tried to share the news, Dad cut me off mid-sentence. He told me that maybe this time I'd actually stick with something instead of jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. My brother laughed and said at least someone was willing to pay me to waste time on the internet. Mom just shook her head and changed the subject to my nephew's soccer tournament. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, watching my family dismiss the biggest professional achievement of my life like it was nothing. My sister leaned over and whispered that I shouldn't take it personally. They just worried about me because I was always the embarrassment of the family. She said it like it was a fact, like it was something everyone just accepted. That night, I made a decision. I was done trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth their respect. The client I'd mentioned turned out to be everything I'd hoped for and more. Within 3 months, they'd referred me to 2 other companies. By spring, I had a waiting list of clients and was turning down projects. The cramped apartment that had been a source of shame became my headquarters, but it wasn't going to work much longer. I started looking at condos in the most expensive part of the city, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I could finally afford the life I'd always wanted. The place I found was everything I'd dreamed of: floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, a modern kitchen with granite countertops, 2 bedrooms with one converted into the perfect home office, and a balcony that caught the sunset every evening. The down payment was more than my parents had paid for their entire house 30 years ago. I signed the papers on a Tuesday and got the keys on Friday. Standing in my empty condo, looking out at the city skyline, I felt something I hadn't experienced around my family in years: pride. That's when the idea hit me. I'd always been told I was the embarrassment, the one who didn't fit in, the one who shouldn't be taken seriously. But now I had something they couldn't dismiss or diminish. I had success on my own terms, and I was going to celebrate it properly. I spent the next 2 weeks planning the perfect housewarming party. Not just any party, the kind of event that would make it clear exactly how well I was doing. I hired a catering company that specialized in the kind of food you'd find at high-end corporate events. I arranged for a bartender who knew how to make drinks that cost more than most people's dinner. I even hired a photographer to capture everything. The guest list was carefully curated. My closest friends, my business contacts, my clients, my neighbors from the building, people who knew me, respected me, and genuinely wanted to celebrate my success. I sent out elegant invitations with embossed lettering and RSVP cards. The kind of invitations my family would have mocked me for if they'd received them. But they didn't receive them. For the first time in my life, my family wasn't invited to something I was hosting. No mom and dad, no brother and sister-in-law, no sister and her husband, no nieces and nephews, no aunts and uncles who'd spent years making comments about when I was going to grow up and get serious about life. The party was scheduled for a Saturday evening. I spent Friday setting up, arranging furniture, making sure every detail was perfect. My friends started arriving early to help, and seeing their excitement made me realize how different this felt from every family gathering I'd ever attended. These people were genuinely happy for me. They wanted to be there. By 7 o'clock, my condo was filled with laughter and conversation. The photographer moved through the crowd, capturing moments of genuine celebration. My biggest client gave a toast about how working with me had transformed their business. My neighbor from down the hall mentioned that she'd been bragging to her friends about the successful entrepreneur who'd moved into the building. I posted photos throughout the evening. The spread of catered food, the view from my balcony, groups of friends raising glasses in celebration. Each post got dozens of likes and comments from people congratulating me on the new place and the obvious success of the party. The best photo was taken around 9 o'clock. I was standing in my living room, surrounded by friends, holding a glass of champagne and genuinely smiling. The city lights twinkled behind me through those floor-to-ceiling windows, and everything about the image screamed success and happiness. I posted it with a simple caption about being grateful for good friends and new beginnings. That's when my phone started buzzing. My sister was the first to call. I let it go to voicemail. Then my brother. Then Mom. I ignored them all and focused on my guests, but I could see the notifications piling up on my lock screen. The first text came from my sister around 10 o'clock. She'd seen the photos and wanted to know why she hadn't been invited to my housewarming party. She said the place looked amazing and she couldn't believe I hadn't told the family about buying a condo. My brother's text was more direct. He asked if I was seriously throwing a party and not inviting family. He said Mom was upset and Dad was confused about why I was being so secretive about my living situation. But it was the comments on my Instagram posts that really told the story. My friends and colleagues were leaving congratulatory messages, talking about what a great time they'd had, praising the beautiful space and the perfect party. Mixed in with those were comments from extended family members who'd seen the posts through mutual connections. My cousin asked why she hadn't known I'd bought a place. My aunt commented that the condo looked incredible and she was so proud of how well I was doing. My uncle, who'd always been the most vocal about my lack of direction, left a comment saying he had no idea I'd been so successful and asking when he could see the place in person. Each comment from family members was like a small victory. These were people who'd spent years treating me like a failure, and now they were seeing evidence that I'd built something impressive without them even knowing about it. The calls continued throughout the weekend. Mom left a voicemail saying she was hurt that I hadn't shared such big news with the family. She said they would have loved to celebrate with me, and she didn't understand why I was shutting them out. Dad's message was shorter but more pointed. He said he'd seen the photos and wanted to know how I'd afforded such an expensive place. He asked if I was in debt or if I'd gotten involved in something questionable to make that kind of money so quickly. My brother called Sunday morning and actually got me to answer. He said the family was planning to drive over and see the place, maybe take me out to dinner to celebrate properly. I told him I was busy with work and couldn't host visitors. He pressed, saying it would just be for an hour, but I held firm. He finally asked directly why I hadn't invited them to the party. I told him the truth. I said that for years, every time I tried to share good news or celebrate an achievement, the family had found ways to diminish it or dismiss it. I'd been called an embarrassment so many times that I'd started to believe it myself. This party was about celebrating with people who actually supported me and believed in what I was building. He was quiet for a long moment before saying that maybe I was being too sensitive, that family was supposed to tease each other, and that everyone was proud of me even if they didn't always show it the right way. I asked him to name one time in the past 5 years when anyone in the family had genuinely celebrated one of my accomplishments without making a joke or expressing doubt about my choices. He couldn't answer. Update 1. The Instagram comments kept coming throughout the week. What started as a simple celebration post had turned into something much bigger. Friends were tagging other friends, colleagues were sharing stories about working with me, and the engagement was unlike anything I'd ever posted. But the family comments were what really caught my attention. My aunt had shared one of my photos to her own Instagram with a caption about how proud she was of her nephew's success. Several of her friends commented asking about me, and she responded with glowing descriptions of my business and my new condo. My cousin, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, sent me a direct message asking for advice about starting her own business. She said she'd had no idea I was doing so well and wanted to know if I'd be willing to mentor her. Most surprisingly, my sister-in-law commented on multiple photos asking about the interior designer I'd used and the building amenities. When I told her I'd done all the decorating myself and researched the building extensively before buying, she seemed genuinely impressed. The contrast was striking. Extended family members who barely knew me were celebrating my success, and asking to be more involved in my life, while my immediate family was focused on why they'd been excluded from the party. Wednesday evening, Mom showed up at my building unannounced. The doorman called up to ask if I was expecting her, and I almost said no. But curiosity got the better of me, and I told him to send her up. She stood in my doorway looking around the hallway with obvious surprise. She commented that the building was much nicer than she'd expected and asked if I was sure I could afford the monthly fees on top of the mortgage. I invited her in, and watching her reaction to my condo was both satisfying and sad. She walked through each room slowly, taking in the details, asking questions about the appliances and the view. She seemed genuinely impressed but also confused, like she couldn't reconcile this success with her image of me as the family disappointment. She asked how long I'd been planning to buy a place and why I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. I explained that I'd been working toward this goal for years, but every time I tried to talk about my business growth or financial progress, the conversation had been shut down or turned into a joke. She insisted that wasn't true, that the family was always interested in what I was doing. I reminded her of specific instances: the Thanksgiving when Dad had dismissed my biggest client, the Christmas when my brother had made jokes about my internet business, the Easter when she'd asked if I needed help paying my rent in front of everyone. She was quiet for a while, looking out at the river view. Finally, she admitted that maybe the family hadn't always been as supportive as they should have been. She said they worried about me because my path was so different from what they understood, and sometimes worry came out as criticism. I appreciated the acknowledgement, but I also pointed out that their worry had turned into a pattern of dismissal that had lasted for years. I'd stopped sharing good news because I'd learned to expect negative reactions. She asked if I was planning to cut the family out of my life entirely. I told her that wasn't my goal, but I also wasn't going to keep subjecting myself to environments where my achievements were minimized and my choices were constantly questioned. Before she left, she asked if she could bring Dad by to see the place. I said I'd think about it. Update 2. The Instagram post had taken on a life of its own. A local lifestyle blogger had somehow found it and reached out asking if she could feature my condo in an article about young entrepreneurs in the city. A real estate agent commented asking if I'd be interested in being featured in their marketing materials as a success story. My business was benefiting too. 3 potential clients had reached out after seeing the posts and learning about my work through the comments. One of them specifically mentioned that they were impressed by my obvious success and wanted to work with someone who was clearly thriving. But the family situation was getting more complicated. My brother had started commenting on my posts regularly, leaving messages about how proud he was and how he couldn't wait to see the place in person. The sudden change in tone was jarring after years of dismissive comments. My sister had taken a different approach. She'd started sharing articles about successful entrepreneurs on her own social media, tagging me in posts about people who'd built businesses from nothing. It felt performative, like she was trying to publicly associate herself with my success after years of treating it as embarrassing. The most interesting development came from my dad. He'd never been active on social media, but he'd apparently created an Instagram account just to follow me and like my posts. Mom mentioned during a phone call that he'd been asking detailed questions about my business model and client base. She said he'd admitted to her that he'd never really understood what I did for work, and seeing the evidence of my success had made him realize he should have asked more questions instead of making assumptions. That weekend, my brother showed up at my building with his wife and kids. They hadn't called ahead, just appeared in the lobby and asked the doorman to announce them. When I came down to meet them, my brother said they'd been in the neighborhood and wanted to see if I was free for a quick visit. I knew it wasn't true. My building was nowhere near anywhere they'd normally be, but I was curious about what they really wanted. I brought them up to the condo, and watching my nephews run around the space while my sister-in-law took photos was surreal. My brother spent the entire visit asking questions about my business that he'd never shown interest in before. He wanted to know about my client acquisition strategy, my pricing model, my growth plans. He even asked if I'd ever considered expanding and hiring employees. When his wife posted photos from the visit on her own Instagram, tagging the location and gushing about my incredible success, I realized what was happening. My family wasn't just trying to reconcile with me. They were trying to associate themselves with my success publicly. The comments on her post were telling. Friends of theirs were asking about me, impressed by the condo and curious about my business. Several people mentioned that they had no idea my brother's family was connected to such a successful entrepreneur. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me was satisfied that they were finally acknowledging my achievements, but another part was frustrated that it had taken such obvious, undeniable evidence of success for them to take me seriously. Update 3. 3 weeks after the party, my family dynamics had completely shifted. The same people who'd spent years treating me as the embarrassment were now trying to position themselves as my biggest supporters. My sister had started a group chat with the extended family, sharing updates about my business and posting photos from my Instagram. She'd appointed herself as my unofficial publicist, which was ironic considering she'd been one of my harshest critics. Dad had surprised everyone by asking if he could invest in my business. During a family dinner that I'd finally agreed to attend, he pulled me aside and said he'd been researching digital marketing companies and thought mine had serious growth potential. He wanted to know if I'd consider taking on a silent partner. The offer was tempting from a financial standpoint, but I was wary of mixing family and business, especially given our history. I told him I'd think about it, but privately I was concerned about what would happen to our relationship if the business ever hit a rough patch. My brother had taken a different approach. He'd started referring clients from his accounting firm to me, and several of them had turned into significant contracts. He'd also begun asking for my advice on his own career, wondering if he should consider leaving Dad's firm to start his own practice. The most dramatic change was in how I was treated at family gatherings. Suddenly, I was the one everyone wanted to talk to. Cousins who'd barely acknowledged me before were asking about my business. Aunts and uncles were introducing me to their friends as their successful nephew. My achievements were being celebrated instead of dismissed. But the validation felt hollow. These were the same people who'd made me feel like a failure for years, and now they were treating me like a success story because I had a nice condo and some Instagram photos to prove my worth. The real test came during a family barbecue at my parents' house. I was standing in the backyard, watching my nephews play, when I overheard my sister talking to our cousin about me. She was describing my business success and my condo, but then she added that she'd always known I'd figure things out eventually, that the family had always been supportive of my entrepreneurial spirit. It was a complete rewriting of history, and it made me realize that nothing had fundamentally changed. My family still couldn't acknowledge that they'd been wrong about me. Instead, they were pretending that they'd been supportive all along. I decided to address it directly. During dinner, when Dad started bragging to the table about my latest client acquisition, I interrupted him. I said I appreciated the support, but I wanted to acknowledge that it hadn't always been this way. I reminded everyone of the years of criticism, the dismissive comments, the constant suggestions that I needed to get a real job. The table went quiet. Mom looked uncomfortable. My brother stared at his plate. My sister tried to laugh it off, saying that families always tease each other and that I was being too sensitive about old jokes. I told them that calling someone an embarrassment wasn't teasing and that dismissing their achievements wasn't joking around. I said I was grateful that they were finally taking my success seriously, but I also needed them to acknowledge that their previous treatment had been hurtful and unfair. Dad was the first to speak up. He admitted that he'd been wrong to dismiss my business for so long, and that he'd let his own lack of understanding turn into unfair criticism. He said he was proud of what I'd built and sorry that it had taken him so long to see it. My brother followed, acknowledging that he'd made jokes at my expense because he'd been jealous of my independence and courage to take risks. He said he'd always played it safe and had resented me for being willing to bet on myself. My sister was more defensive, but she eventually admitted that she'd been worried about me and had expressed that worry in ways that probably felt like attacks. She said she'd never meant to make me feel like an embarrassment. Mom cried a little and said she was sorry for not being more supportive, that she'd been scared I was going to fail and had tried to protect me by encouraging more traditional choices. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, I felt like my family was actually seeing me as I was, rather than as their projection of what I should be. The Instagram post that had started everything was still getting occasional comments and likes. But more importantly, it had forced a conversation that was long overdue. I'd proven to myself and to my family that I could succeed on my own terms, and I'd learned that sometimes the best way to change how people treat you is to stop accepting treatment that doesn't match your worth. My condo remained my sanctuary, the physical proof of everything I'd built without their help or approval. But now it was also a symbol of something else. The moment I'd stopped being the family embarrassment and started being someone who demanded respect. The revenge had been sweeter than I'd expected, but the reconciliation that followed had been even more valuable. Sometimes you have to exclude people from your success before they can truly appreciate what you've accomplished.